Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Vertec Knowledge Series. We're recording this. Sorry for the delay. We had a technical difficulty with Zoom. Not probably a new story for a lot of you, but welcome. We're glad to have you here now. And welcome to Dr. Arellano. Welcome, Dr. Santos. How are you guys?
Good. Great, thank you.
So last minute struggle, a little chaos right before the meeting, which is fine. I hope you're all doing well. So today's webinar is on coupling the arms and legs during treadmill walking, the costs, benefits, and trade-offs. And we're very excited to feature Dr. Arellano, who's done some really exciting research in this area. So before I tell you a little bit more about him and play the presentation, just a quick reminder of how this always works if you haven't joined us before. So during the presentation, we encourage you to write your questions in the chat feature, and Dr. Arellano can answer those throughout the pre-recording. That's a great way to have some extra time with him to get all of your questions answered. His presentation runs about 36 minutes, so you'll want to squeeze your questions in as soon as you can. And then following the presentation, we're going to have a few extra minutes to do some Q&A as well. And we have some questions that were prepared in advance that we can lead that off with. So on that note, I will introduce you to Dr. Arellano. So Chris Arellano is an assistant professor in the University of Houston's Health and Human Performance Department. He earned a BS degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Texas at Austin and an MS degree in biomechanics and motor control at the University of Houston. He was then selected as a NASA Harriet G. Jenkins predoctoral fellow, which provided him with the opportunity to earn his PhD in integrative physiology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. At CU Boulder, he studied human walking and running and attempted to understand how different balance control strategies minimize metabolic cost. Shortly after that, he completed a postdoctoral fellowship at CU Boulder, studying how aging affects the ability to control movement. He then worked as a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Brown University, studying the significance of muscle tendon shape change on locomotor movement. Dr. Arellano and his team at the University of Houston tackle problems that range from basic to applied, but the integrative understanding of animal locomotion remains an integral part of his scientific curiosity and interest. So completely in line with all the exciting things that we're talking about here and that our presenters share with us. I'm going to add a pin here so we can see you a little bit better. So on that note, and sorry, I'm reading that quickly because we want to get to your exciting presentation. Dr. Santos, who you all know if you've been here before, has his PhD in biomechanics and movement sciences and is an accomplished PT himself who worked with Paralympic athletes and people with balance impairments in his own clinic. He's a senior applied biomechanist with Vertec and also my partner in creating this webinar series. So on that note, everybody, I will go ahead and share my screen and we will pull up the presentation. So you guys can mute and turn off your video and we'll go ahead with that.
All right, welcome. This is our Vertec webinar. My name is Chris Arellano. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Houston. And today I'm going to be talking about the effects of coupling the legs and arms during treadmill walking and really thinking about the cost, the benefits, and the trade-offs. So I want you to kind of imagine from an evolutionary perspective. When, if we look at this diagram here on the left, the basic idea is that we started off with using the four limbs to help push and accelerate the body along the ground. Now, when we transitioned from quadrupedal to bipedal, the arms were essentially freed from this mechanical burden of supporting and accelerating the body weight. Now, in terms of our current understanding for the role of the arms, and as they swing during walking, there comes this question of what is the functional significance? And if we want to think about the functional significance, we think about the mechanics and the energetics. And really, it's thinking about, do they provide benefits? Does the act of swinging the arms during walking provide any type of benefit? So from a mechanical perspective, it's been shown by Elfman in 1939 that when you swing the arms during walking, it helps reduce the angular momentum that is generated along the vertical axis. It also helps reduce the vertical displacement of the center mass. And it's also been shown more recently in 2001 by Lee et al. That when you swing your arms, this helps to reduce that free vertical moment. Essentially, that as your foot makes contact with the ground, it reduces any type of twisting motion of the body. Now, in terms of its link to energetics, the question that comes up from these insights is, well, does that help reduce the metabolic energy required to walk? And that question still remains somewhat controversial. So basic question is, does arm swing help reduce cost, metabolic cost? We can take a look at this timeline with the first experiment conducted by Ralston in 1965. And he showed that swinging the arms provides no metabolic benefit. Now, it wasn't until 40 years later that we had a series of experiments happening around 2008, 2009. And we look at the work from Umberger and Ortega, they both found that when you swing your arms, this helps reduce the cost. And that following year, we had 3 more experiments, one by Ponzer, another by Yazar and colleagues, another by Collins. And 2 out of those 3 experiments did find that arm swing helped to reduce cost. Now, we look a little bit more closer at these experiments from Ortega, Umberger, and Collins. They all showed something very similar. So what you're seeing here on this graph, on the left here, is the net metabolic power. This is expressed in watts per kg. This is like the same idea of, we have someone walk on a treadmill, we can measure their rate of oxygen consumption, how much metabolic energy is required to walk. And they all showed the same particular trends. When you have a subject or a human walking and you restrict their arms, this elevates or increases the demand for their net metabolic power. So more energy required to walk. Now you'll note that all of these experiments were done around what we refer to as optimal speeds. And this is roughly where a speed where humans tend to prefer to walk and helps minimize metabolic energy. Now, we were curious in our lab to think about, well, what explains this potential benefit? Well, what's the link between the mechanics and the energetics of walking? So if we look a little bit more closer on the work of Collins et al., here on the left, he did some experiments where he had subjects walking on a treadmill and over ground, and measured essentially the twisting moment, right? What we call the free vertical moment that's generated along the ground when you're walking with your arm swing, right? Swinging normally, when the arms are restricted, and when the subject's asked to hold the arms to their side. And he found a consistent trend. He found that when you restrict the arms, this increases that free vertical moment that you apply to the ground. Now, how does this couple with the need to consume energy, right? The net metabolic power, where he showed a similar trend. He said he showed that when you take away the arms, restrict the arms, this increases the net metabolic power demand that's required to walk. So there seems to be that clear link, right, between the mechanics and energetics of walking, and in particular, the influence of arm swing. So in our lab, we were curious to understand whether this is a highly conserved feature across all walking speeds, right? So one might think, well, if arm swing is beneficial, right, and we look at this, what's called the net cost of transport curve, right? So, and this is a trend that you can find in any animal, any human, where humans tend to prefer a speed that minimizes the net cost of transport. And what that means is the amount of joules of energy, okay, that's required to move 1 unit mass or kilogram of your body mass 1 unit meter. And so if we think about this minimum here, this is where we kind of prefer to walk. And this is kind of just a illustration to show what we find when we walk across all these speeds and we allow those arms to swing at a normal range of motion. Okay. Now, the idea that we had is, well, if we take away the influence of the arms, don't allow humans to swing their arms, this should elevate the need to use energy, okay? Increase that net cost of transport. And we would find, the idea is that we would find a kind of a small increase in the net cost of transport, and that difference would grow and grow as we walk faster and faster. So we tested 2 predictions, right? First prediction was walking without arm swing would increase the cost, okay? And the metabolic penalty for not swinging the arm would grow at these faster and faster speeds. And we're talking about speeds up to 2 meters per second, which is pretty fast. So what did we find? So this was a work that was published by Shanice Thomas, a PhD student working in the lab. And this paper was published in the Journal of Biomechanics earlier this year. So simple experiment. We had subjects walking on a treadmill, swinging their arms, another set of conditions without no arm swing. And we tested these effects across a range of speeds. You see on the bottom here, from the slowest speed of 0.5 meters per second, all the way up to 2 meters per second. And this is the way that we restricted their arm swing. We just simply asked subjects to hold their hands behind their back in a very relaxed manner. And you can see here our basic setup. We had reflective markers on the body to not only capture the forces that they generate along the ground using the vertex, but we also use the Vicon motion capture system to measure the motion of the body. So here's our key findings. So let's think about the energetics. Here we have our net metabolic power that's required to walk is expressed in watts per kg. And this is our data across speeds, slow to fast speeds, from 0.5, a very slow speed, all the way up to 2 meters per second. Here in the open circles, we have no arm swing. And then in the closed circles, we have arm swing. And we can see, right, this is kind of classic nonlinear increase in the demand, in the energy demand required to walk. And we can see the small difference here at the bottom here. You know, it's hard to tell any difference at these relatively slow speeds, but as we walk faster and faster, this difference grows. So it's indicating, or at least suggesting, that when you take away the arms when walking, and especially at these faster and faster speeds, the metabolic energy to walk increases substantially. Now, how does this translate to when we're thinking about the net cost of transport? So let's see how that data played out. So here we have net cost of transport expressed in joules per kilogram per meter, again as a function of speed. And now we kind of see something interesting here. Right? We see at these relatively slow speeds at 0.5, 0.75, there's no significant difference between the two conditions. So at least for these relatively slow speeds, arm swing doesn't really provide a benefit, a metabolic benefit, I should say. But when you walk at your optimal speeds, let's say roughly around 1 meters per second, and at faster and faster speeds, your net cost of transport increases dramatically, right? So suggesting that arm swing plays a much more functional role at these faster and faster speeds. And this is pretty consistent, right? At optimal speeds and above, the cost increases greatly. Now, what about the mechanics? So what do we find about the mechanics here? So we're looking at the free vertical moment that we apply on the surface of the treadmill. Okay? So we have subjects walking on this instrumental treadmill, vertex treadmill, and we're essentially measuring that twisting moment. Okay? Again, usually referred to as the free vertical moment. And this shows some typical traces here. So here's the applied vertical moment as a percentage of your stance phase. So when that foot's in contact with the treadmill, and we can see that the moment that's generated on the ground increases. It systematically increases and has a peak at about 75% of your stance phase. And this is pretty consistent across all speeds here. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is the difference between arm swing and no arm swing. So an arm swing, here's the black line, kind of with the gray shaded region, dark gray shaded region. And then the no arm swing condition is the dashed line with the much lighter gray region. And we can see that systematic difference, right? There's a small increase in that peak moment that we generate on the ground. So, and we were thinking about the twisting moment, we're talking about the moment that's acting more in the lateral direction, okay? And you can clearly see at the fastest speed, right, all the way to the right here in this figure, at the fastest speed of 2 meters per second, look how much the free vertical moment, that peak moment, increases when you're walking without arm swing. So we can clearly see there's a mechanical effect, right? When you take away the arms is not allowed to do its functional role, right? To help minimize that twisting motion of the body. And that's reflective of this increased peak in the free vertical moment. Now, the other key finding from this, if we think about the systematic difference in these free vertical moments between conditions, right? Between no arm swing and arm swing. Here's what we're showing here on the left. So we essentially, we extracted the positive peak free vertical moment, and we plotted those trends across walking speed. So on here at the bottom, we have no arm swing. Here on top, in the open circles, we have no arm swing. And we can see a kind of a systematic difference between these two lines. When we walk with that arm swing, that peak free vertical moment shows a small but steady, consistent increase between conditions. Now, if we were to try to understand, right, does arm swing, or does does the change in the peak free vertical moment, does that explain this increase in the demand for net metabolic power? Now, this graph shows one clear thing. When you plot the change in net metabolic power, right, the increase in the energy demand required to walk without arm swing, and if you plot that change as a function of the change in the positive peak free vertical moment, there's no systematic relationship between the two. So from our findings, we extrapolate this graph to mean that change in the peak free vertical moment does not fully explain that increased demand that's required to walk. So something else is going on, which we haven't really understood yet. So takeaway points here from what I've shown you so far, at least from work from our lab. We've shown that arm swing, when the arms are allowed to swing, it provides clear metabolic benefits, especially at optimal speeds and above, provides mechanical benefits. So it helps reduce those peak free vertical moments that we generate along the ground. And it also helps to minimize the amount of energy that's required to walk. So those are some basic insights, I would say more fundamental. Now, I want to transition to thinking about, well, when we're thinking about arm swing, what are some of the applied type of benefits, right? Or how can we apply these insights to think about how it might help people walk with certain pathologies? Okay. Now, I want us to think about this central question that's dominated the field for quite a while now, right? And this question is, what is the biomechanical basis for the metabolic cost of human walking? And I want to put this in the context to understand what is the significance of the arms in human walking, okay? So to understand that, let's think about this task by task approach. So this is work that was, that's been developed from many colleagues, work that was kind of done in my mentor's lab, Roger Crom. And the basic idea here is trying to break down the metabolic cost of walking. And and if we imagine this kind of bubble right at the bottom here, the question is metabolic cost. This bubble represents 100%, the total energy required, right, to walk at a certain speed. Now, what my colleagues did is they did some simple experiments. So in one example, right, they asked the question, well, how much does it cost to support your body weight while walking? And they developed this simple trolley system here, shown on the left. And the basic idea is that you have humans walking on a treadmill. You can lift them up with a certain amount of support, and you can lift them up ranging from, say, 25% of their body weight, 50%, 75%, and 100%. And so if you look at the graph here on the right, here what they did is they measured their net metabolic rate while walking, measured it across these different conditions. And what we see here is that when we reduce the need to support body weight, going from, say, 100% to 75%, 50, and 25, there's a clear reduction in the need to consume energy, right? And if we were to extrapolate that to, and this is very theoretical, right? We're to extrapolate that to 0% body weight. So if you took away the entire need to support your body weight during walking, this extrapolates, right, to about 28% of your total cost, okay? The total net cost of walking. Now, what about propulsion? Another task that's required during walking is the need to propel your body in the forward direction, right? So the way they tackled this problem was they developed another device, and very simple device. You can see here, these are made out of a bunch of pulleys, some cables here, and some rubber tubing that acts like a spring. And the basic idea is that you crank this winch and you provide an assistive force that helps propel the body in the forward direction. Right? They did this on a force measuring treadmill. Now it did the same thing. They measured net metabolic rate. Here it's expressed as a percent of normal walking. Okay. So here on the right, we have 0%, so no assistive force. And they systematically applied a assistive force of 5%, 10%, and 15%. And they found kind of a sweet spot here, right? At about 10% of your body weight. If you applied an 18 horizontal force, that's 10% of your body weight, you can reduce the demand of walking by 47%. Okay? So what this means is that if you extrapolate this finding, what this means is that the need to propel the body requires about 40% of your net metabolic power. Now, another task is leg swing, right? When we walk, we have to swing our leg every step. Now, in order to kind of figure out what the cost of leg swinging is, now they adapted this device to not only pull in the forward direction, but now they also developed what's called a leg swing assist device, where they have the same kind of setup, right? A winch, you have some load cells, you have some pieces of rubber tubing that act like a spring, and now they've attached it to their feet here. And so when this foot, right, is on the ground or on the treadmill, and this foot moves backwards, it's going to stretch this spring, it's going to store the energy, and once that foot leaves the treadmill, right, it's going to release the energy to help propel that leg in the forward direction. They assist with leg swing. Now let's see what they found. Now here again on the right, we have net metabolic rate expressed as a percent of normal walking. Okay. Here on the far right, we have no assistive forces. So they didn't apply any forward assistive forces or any type of leg swing assistive forces. So this is a net metabolic rate of 100%. And what they found is that when you apply the right combination of an assistive force, right, in the horizontal direction. So here was kind of 10% of assistive forward propulsion. That resulted in at about a 43% reduction, right? Now what they did is combine that forward assistive force with a leg swing assistive force. And this is what's shown in this particular bar or this particular column here. So they had a 10% assistive force along with a 3% leg assist force. And they found a 10% reduction. So from those findings, they extrapolated that the cost to swing the legs is about 10%. Now, another one is lateral balance, right? When we walk, we have to spend some energy to control our ability to balance. Now, this was done in a series of experiments. First started off by Dahlin, Shipman, Crom, and Quo in 2004. And they did an experiment where they had people walking on a treadmill and they attached this, what's called an external lateral stabilization system, right? So they're walking on the treadmill, they have these springs on both sides, and every time they veer to the left or right, it's gonna help maintain the position of that, of the body on the middle of the treadmill, right, to help stabilize. And what they found is that when you stabilize people, this actually reduces the metabolic cost of walking by about 6%. And this was confirmed by other experiments by Dean, Alexander, and Quo, 2007, Ortega et al. Also showed a 3%. So it ranges between, I would say, 3 to 9% is the cost of lateral balance. Right, so let's put this all together. Okay, breaking down all these experiments, they've shown that the cost for body weight support is at most 28% for walking. The cost for propulsion is 45 to 47%. The cost of lateral balance is 3 to 9%. And the cost of leg swing is about 10%. So pretty much, it's, explains 100%, not perfectly, but almost 100% for the net cost of walking. So the question that came to my mind and the kind of the key insight, right, from all these experiments is that the metabolic cost that's required to walk can be fully explained by the mechanical demands placed on the legs, okay? Placed on the legs. So where's the cost of swinging the arms? It's nowhere in the big picture of these experiments. Now, to understand what is the cost of swinging the arms, let's look at some previous experiments, right, that have studied the EMG activity of the upper limb muscles. And let's also think about some experiments that have treated the arms like pendulums, these passive swinging pendulums, okay? So if we can understand that, the EMG activity and the pendulum mechanics, we might have an answer to this question. So let's start off with Ballesteros, who did some really interesting work in 1965 and measured the muscle activity of various upper limb muscles. So here's kind of just a snapshot from her classic paper. Here's the muscle activity of the posterior deltoid, the middle deltoid, the anterior deltoid doesn't show much activity at all, right? And then here's the upper latissimus dorsi muscle. And we can clearly see that there's some EMG activity when the arms swing back and forth during walking. But what's difficult about this, this graph and how to interpret it is that we don't know what the relative intensity of these signals are, okay? In terms of what is the maximum EMG activity of those particular muscles. Now, to understand that, we can look to Kutz and Buschek and Jing in 2012, who did a nice study trying to understand how much muscle activity is required to swing the arms when walking at these kind of comfortable speeds and at these much faster speeds. So let's look at their data. So here on the right, they did a very interesting experiment and actually followed a normalization speed where they quantified the EMG amplitude relative to the maximum EMG activity that was recorded during an isometric maximum voluntary contraction. And here what they show for a bunch of different muscles in the upper limb, there's the anterior deltoid, posterior deltoid, the biceps muscle, the triceps, pectoralis major, the trapezius, okay, latissimus dorsi. And we can all kind of see a clear trend, okay, during this percent of the walking gait cycle. But notice here, notice the magnitude of these trends here. We look at the y-axis. And if you compile all the data together, the EMG activity for all these muscles ranges between 5 to 10% of their maximum voluntary contraction. So I would interpret this to say that there's really minimal EMG actuation or activity that's required to swing the arms. So what does that mean? Right? There's little muscle actuation. How do the arms swing when they walk? Well, to answer this question, there's a really interesting experiment that was done by Collins, Adamczyk, and Kuo in 2012, and showed that actually the arms can swing passively. They did these really interesting experiments where they attached these mechanical arms. Okay, there's no neural control, no muscles involved in this case, and they showed by simply walking, you can induce dynamics that initiate the forward and backward swing, different amplitudes, different phases between the left and right side. And this is purely a mechanical model, okay? Purely mechanical. Again, no muscle actuation involved. So from these experiments, right, we can kind of come to two different conclusions. First one shows little muscular actuation required to swing the arms. Second one shows that arm swing is actually dominated by these passive dynamics. Now, this inspired us in my lab to think about, well, what if the arms could play a more active role during the walk? How can we envision that? And this was work that was led by a PhD student, Daisy Vega, work done in the lab. And we came up with this kind of, started off kind of like a silly experiment, right? We said, well, how can we make the arms play a more active role, right? And what happens if we attach the arms in a way where we use the wrist of one arm, attach a rope, connect it to a pulley, and then connect it back onto the foot of the same side of the body, okay? Same side leg. Now, the basic idea is that with this setup, we could use the arms in a more active way to help with leg swing, right? So if you think about normal walking, as your arm goes from this swinging forward, okay, protraction, and then transition from protraction to retraction, that's the same instant in time when the foot leaves the ground. So we imagine that if we can pull with that arm, right, in the backwards direction, during retraction, that would help with leg swing and hopefully reduce the metabolic cost of walking. Now, what was the inspiration for this? One inspiration, and I would say the biggest motivation, was thinking about work that was done by Berman and Harkema in their classic paper in the year 2000. It was published in the Journal of Physical Therapy. And what you can see here on the left in figure 1, this is a traditional type of training modality that's used in patients with who are trying to recover from a spinal cord injury. And what you can see on this step diagram, you have several physical therapists, right, that are helping to drive the limbs while this patient is trying to recover their ability to walk. So you have a physical therapist in the back controlling the hips to move side to side. You have physical therapists on the left and right side of the body to help control the leg, right, and the move, the coordination. And then what you also see, what's kind of interesting here, is that you see these poles, right, that this patient is holding. And that what you don't see here, there's another physical therapist behind here that's moving the poles back and forth, and all with the goal of trying to coordinate that swinging motion of the arms with the swinging motion of the legs. Okay? So it takes about 4 to 5 physical therapists at once. And then here on the right, you see another way that they've trained patients to help recover their step and ability, right? Overground walking. Now this patient has some ability to move their legs, and now they're just really focused on the upper limb coordination with the legs. So they have physical therapists that are helping to drive, right? This is all external assistance here, all external, okay? So we were motivated by that. We said, well, instead of allowing physical therapists, right, drive or provide some external assistance, what would happen if we gave control, right, to the patient themselves? And we connected the arms in such a way that they have to use the arms, right, increase their muscular activity to help drive the lower limbs. And this is kind of a basic illustration of how this simple rope pulley system works, right? I guess, well, how we thought it was going to work. So basic idea here, right? We start on the left. We have the arm kind of in that period of going during retraction, protraction, and then moving back during retraction. And the idea here is that the arm pulls back, right? As the arm pulls back here in this figure, going from figure A to B, arm pulls back, driving the leg in the forward direction, right? And the basic idea is that we can isolate the active role of the arms to help with leg swing. And then here shows at the end of the period of retraction here, the leg, the foot makes contact with the treadmill, the rope goes slack, and then it all starts again, the continuous cycle. So again, this is both for the for the right arm and the left arm. We also have a rope pulley connection with the left arm as well. And this was all done, not shown here, this was all done on a dual instrumented Vertec treadmill. Okay, so we had a treadmill on the right, underneath the right foot, and a treadmill underneath the left foot. Okay? And here's kind of how it looked for our particular setup. We have our Vertec treadmill, okay, split belt. We have our markers. We had some EMG sensors. And then we had a couple of load cells here at the wrist to rope connection, which can allow us to measure the force. And then here's our simple rope pulley design here. Okay, very crude. We built this, buying stuff from your local hardware store, very, very cheap, but it was also very easy and very simple, which we wanted. That was kind of the goal, right? Create something very simple that could be potentially beneficial. And if you're interested in knowing more about the details of this work, you can find our recently published paper in the Journal of Neuroengineering and Rehabilitation. So what did we find? So let's look at the forces that were generated along the ground and the forces that were generated along the wrist. Okay, so here in this diagram, we have the assistive force. We plot this as a function of, or a percent of body weight. So we can see here, right, there's a period of when there's little to no force being generated at the wrist. And at the period, here's a percent of the gait cycle. And this right here, this region that's highlighted in gray shows the middle or the period at which our foot's on the ground and we're at mid stance, okay? So here we have little to no force. We have a sharp rise in the force that's generated at about the wrist, okay? And what we can see, this coincides with the force, the propelling force that's generated along the ground, okay? Here, so here in black, in this black line here is the forces that are generated in the anterior posterior direction. And if you're familiar with kind of ground reaction forces during walking, right? This shows a clear braking force when your foot makes contact with the ground, you reach mid stance, and then you generate a propulsive force to help propel your body. And then here's our typical ground reaction force in the vertical direction, okay? Kind of that double hump shaped pattern. Now, what I want you to take away from this graph is to show that when the assistive force at the wrist occurred, it occurs during the period of propulsion. We see that when we allow the arms to play an active role, right, pulling back, this reduced the force, the propelling force on the ground. And this was about a 33% decrease in the propulsive force. When we compared the vertical forces, there was no difference between the two. So we were able to isolate this effect in the anterior posterior direction. Now let's take a look at the EMG activity of the upper limb muscles. So for that particular propulsive phase, we broke down the time window for the EMG activity, and we normalized that data to the values that we quantified during normal walking. And what you can see here at the bottom here is the EMG activity for the posterior deltoid, the anterior deltoid, triceps, biceps femoris, the lower leg here, rectus femoris, the soleus, the medial gastrocnemius, and the tibialis anterior. So we pretty much measured all the muscles, or not all the muscles, but most of the muscles in the upper limb and the lower limb. And what this black line represents, the 100%, is the line for the percent, or I'm sorry, the normal walking condition, okay, all relative to 100%. So what we find here, we find this, what we call this neuromuscular shift, right? We have a greater EMG activity that's required by the upper limbs. So we found a dramatic increase in the triceps activity and the biceps activity, while at the same time finding a decrease in the activity of these two lower limb muscles, right? The medial gastrocnemius muscle and the soleus, which we know are two key muscles that help for propulsion during walking. Now, what do we find in terms of metabolic energy? Okay, here we have net metabolic power expressed as watts per kg, and we found a systematic decrease in the energy demand. And this is for all subjects. This is what we see here. For all these subjects, a systematic decrease. And on average, we found a 17% decrease in the energy that's required to walk. And that's kind of still counterintuitive to me and to Daisy to find that a 17% decrease. Even though we required more or greater muscle activity in the upper limbs, this was offset by the lower demand placed on the legs, the lower mechanical demand placed on the legs. So what does this mean for future work? Well, one of the ideas that we have is, or really to try to address the question, could this work in a clinical setting, right? In a rehabilitation setting? We kind of thought about these ideas under these inspiration of previous work, right? And trying to help patients who are trying to recover from a spinal cord injury. We think that if we can build the right system and gear it in a very simple way, this might be able to help patients, right? And thinking about a patient as playing a more active role in their own gait retraining. So future work, right? We're thinking about some different designs and ultimately thinking about, right, getting away from this idea of leaving the arms, right, kind of free to move in a more passive way. We want them to move in a more active way, especially in the context of gait rehabilitation. And so we were trying to explore some of these ideas, different designs that we can play around with, and ultimately trying to test this in a population where the ability to use the arms in a more active role could provide some neural benefits to the patient. So key takeaways for this talk, right? We've shown that arm swing provides both mechanical and metabolic benefits. Also shown that arm swing is crucial for helping minimize energy costs. And the questions that remain really is to understand whether arm swing can play a more active role, right, in a gait rehabilitation setting, and possibly lead to the ability of patients to help regain some of their walking pattern, their stepping pattern, and really hope that this could prove useful in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Arellano. You can turn on your video. Welcome. Thank you so much for that presentation. And thank you to everyone in the chat. I was about to name some key people that were having an interesting conversation, but then more people added in, and it's a really great conversation. It's obviously exciting research for a lot of people to see. So thank you for sharing. So I'm just going to go ahead and kick it over to Dr. Santos to kick off the Q&A. And we have, about 10 minutes or so left to answer some live questions as well. So why don't you kick off with that?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. Like always, really interesting. We have a lot of questions coming in our coming here in our chat, and I think before I ask anything, I'll rather, because I can ask you anytime. So let's go to our chat there. I saw that most of them you answered, but I want to go. Let's see if there's a question or people are just commenting. Sorry. We do have a question here asking, with bilateral arm swing, don't they cancel out any AP forces from the arms?
Yes. So that's correct. I was in the middle of trying to respond, but yes, you're correct. So what we're really thinking about is that when the arms swing, right? If you have bilateral arm swing, yes, you would expect that the AP forces would cancel out. But we're really thinking about the forces that are acting along the vertical direction. So we're thinking about just kind of a swinging pendulum, right? We're thinking about that accelerated force that's happening along this line. And we're thinking about how that would translate to the vertical forces that we generate along the ground.
Nice. I want to make a comment myself here that Andy Lin talk about the beliefs also, the arm also apply to like a roundhouse kick by martial arts. So I worked with Olympic martial artists and MMA people, and it is really important for roundhouse and axe kick and those and all those types of kicks. I usually personally work more with balance, just balance related, not with other things. But
I'm laughing because Jason, a buddy of mine, is on here. He says, if I recall, Chris loves some MMA. So yes, I train like in Muay Thai and things like that. So we learn a lot about using the arms to kind of counterbalance our body, especially when we kick. So yeah, that's a very important aspect of balance control, especially when you're trying to kick someone or use the legs in some type of way.
Yeah, we'll have this conversation another time. I did train people from the UFC and those kind of stuff. So that's another.
All right, who are some of the fighters? You're gonna turn this into an MMA hour.
to another day. But again, I think this is so interesting. So Chris, will you move to jogging, to sprinting, to investigate arm swing in more energetic movements?
Yes, Professor DeVita. That's our next interest, is for sure. I've done some previous experiments trying to understand the benefits of arm swing during running, and those have been kind of at one speed. And so I'm really interested in thinking about whether these benefits that we see in walking, do they translate to what we see in running or even in sprinting? And sprinting is a little difficult because you can't necessarily measure aerobic metabolism. You'll have a lot of energy coming from anaerobic sources, but we can measure the forces that are generated along the ground. And I have some ideas about how there might be a kind of an optimal way of swinging the arms to help with that force generation.
Good. So you talk about spinal cord injury and recovering and everything else there. So what are the walking speeds that are typical between versus a healthy subject and a patient when recovering from spinal cord injury?
Yeah, if we think about what's kind of been commonly studied in humans, we find, at least on treadmill walking, people tend to kind of hone in at a speed about 1 to 1.3 meters per second. And that's where we find that helps to minimize their net cost of transport. Now, when you have people walking outside, right, and there's different constraints on the person, then it really depends on what your goal is, right? Do I want to get to this point B as fast as I can? Then maybe you're not really worried about trying to minimize costs. But in a lot of things that we study, especially in the lab, we're thinking about, if you're at a park and you're just taking a stroll, a nice walk, right? We tend to hone in at those speeds that help to minimize the cost. Now, for patients let's say for a patient who's trying to recover from a spinal cord injury, their particular speeds will depend on the severity of their injury. So if you look at the past work of a lot of these studies that have studied patients with spinal cord injury, their speeds could range from say 0.2 to 0.5 meters per second. And a lot of those studies are actually lifting people up by a certain amount of their body weight. So they can't support their body weight by themselves. So they're maybe lifting between say 30 to 50, even sometimes 75% of their body weight. And even with all that body weight support, they still manage, right, to even achieve somewhat of a small speed, 0.3, 0.4. So a lot of that, really that first, at least from what I understand, the initial training is just to help them get the ability to move their legs, right? They have little to no control, and just really getting that leg movement to move back and forth, right? Try to elicit some of those neural benefits from moving those legs in that kind of repetitive pattern. In a way, there's this idea is that the spinal cord can relearn a lot of these movements, right? But it needs the right input, the sensory feedback, the position of the legs, all that needs to be received within the spinal cord in order for it to relearn how to do these movements.
So you talked here about this importance of the leg movement, and what are the benefits of coordinating this arm with that leg for this patient's recovering?
Well, one of the interesting ideas, or the one I find fascinating, is that there's been some really interesting work by Professor Zier, Professor Dietz, and they've studied a lot of the neuronal reflexes, right, during walking, and they find that the reflexes that arise from the leg, they converge in similar parts of the spinal cord where reflexes from the arm also converge. And so when you have people walking, you can elicit a reflex in the tibialis anterior muscle, and that will elicit a reflex on the contralateral side of the arm muscle. And that only happens when the arms are swinging in coordination with the legs. So you have a person walk and you take away their arms so they don't swing, you cannot elicit that same H reflex pattern. So there's something going on and I think Professor Zier or maybe Dietz coined this term, but there's this idea that the arms tends to gate this kind of reflex between the or this neural connection, right? This neural connection is gated between the lower limbs and the upper limbs. And this whole idea stems from this basic CPG pattern, right? This neuronal circuit, when our ancestors were, moving about on all four limbs, right? There was a highly coordinated coordination between the forelimbs and upper limbs. And that typical neural circuitry, I guess you can say, was conserved, right, in humans. And so it's still there. That's the idea. Now where it is exactly, where you pinpoint it, I have no idea. Yeah.
So other question here. Any thoughts about how obesity, especially higher levels of BMI, might relate to arm swing biomechanics and interactions between arm and leg?
Oh yeah, that's a great point. I think when you start to have people that are obese and especially if they're they're heavy set upper body, that might get in the way of the natural arm swinging of the arms. So, and what's kind of funny about these things, I when I'm walking on campus here at U of H, I just kind of look at people walking about, and everyone has a really interesting arm swinging. Like no one really swings the arms in the same way, but everybody seems to kind of follow the same stepping pattern, right? And I've always been curious, what separates someone from kind of a typical arm swinging to some people. And then some people they walk and their right arm is swinging and then their left arm is just kind of still, so they're like this walking, or the opposite. And, I never really understand why that's happening. But yeah, I would say, your body shape and your proportions would definitely affect your ability to, especially, I guess, to be able to kind of, I would say, exploit those passive dynamics.
Yeah, most definitely really interesting. That photo that you showed there with the poles, I used that some time ago in the clinic, and it's pretty interesting. Most of all with Parkinson's patients and cerebral palsy, and that's it's really interesting how each person moved their arms differently.
Did they
But
find that helpful when they were holding on to the poles and you're moving them back and forth?
Yes. So this matter of coordinating, we notice that a lot of people that have not good balance while walking, they sometimes most of them don't move their arms at all, or kind of move them in the opposite direction. So you mainly putting your trunk to the wrong side, right? So you're kind of losing that balance there. So next one, Jason. So look at the reduction in push-off forces. If people train in your environment with biofeedback designed to preserve that anterior ground reaction force at given speed, when they go out of your environment, I wonder if they would increase propulsive force habitually, sort of like error augmented training.
Yes. Yeah. So, this is the idea kind of goes back to, a lot of these motor learning experiments, right? You think about people walking on a treadmill, especially in the split belt treadmill paradigm. Sometimes you can manipulate one side of the treadmill to go faster than the other side, right? And sometimes they've used that in settings where people have kind of a bilateral deficit, right? One leg is maybe weaker than the other, and so they adjust the speed, right? So they makes it more symmetrical. But then when you take away that environment, it kind of messes with their coordination pattern, right? So they have to kind of, when you go back to equal speeds, they're still used to what they just learned, right? So they have to de-adapt. But yes, I would say a great point. It would, I would expect some kind of learning, right, to happen. And keep in mind what we did here in this experiments. We only did this for 7 minutes, so we didn't even really, think about learning or any adaptation. There's kind of questions that are still kind of open, right? Is could the patients learn over time, over long periods of time, to adapt in a better way, get maybe a bigger reduction in cost, right? And then other questions is, well, what is the crossover? Like, what's the effect when you take away this person from the environment? One thing that we've been thinking about is, we only attached the device to this person, and if we're going to try to test this in a clinical setting with, say, patients who are trying to recover from a spinal cord, we want to be able to support them with body weight as well. So this can be easily integrated with the body weight support system. And what's kind of nice about this, right, is that you can think about manipulating the mechanical factors on the body, right? So if you lift them, make it easier for them to walk by reducing their body weight, and you give them the ability to use their arms, right? And you're reducing this cost, then we might be able to play with speed, right? We might be able to have them walk faster and still use the same metabolic rate as if they were walking slower, right? So then now, not only are you helping them getting the stepping patterns, or relearn their stepping patterns, right? But you're doing it across a much greater range in their dynamic repertoire, right? Or that wasn't really available to them in the first place. So that's the way I kind of think about it, right? We make it easier in one spot, but then, hey, we can make it more challenging because we can increase their speed, right? And play with these propulsive forces.
Alyssa's here.
I think it's time, right?
Oh yeah.
TikTok, everybody.
Just one quick thing.
Yeah.
So Paul reminded, and I thought that was really cool too, that Vivian brought a thought about seismic mass, and I thought that was really interesting too. Her questions about there. I think you also said that it's interesting, right?
Yes.
So,
yeah. Yes.
Idea of resonant frequency. It appears that swing dynamic. Oh no, that was your answer. She talked about that, suggested the arm mass acts like a seismic mass damper using civil engineering to reduce center of gravity perturbation buildings during earthquakes. If similar mechanics follow, do you think that might also exist an ideal arm mass or moment of inertia for giving gait speed?
Yes, and I responded to her. I would love to follow up with her about that, but there's some there's some ideas that people have been playing with before, thinking about the arms as these physical pendulums, right? And thinking about when you model the arms as physical pendulums, you can calculate what is their resonant frequency, And interestingly enough, from what I found, unpublished, findings, is that people tend to swing their arms at their resonant frequency. So I think that's another reason why arm swing seems to be cheap, right? You don't have to spend a lot of energy when you're swinging that mass or swinging that pendulum at its resonance. So that's another trick that the body uses. Pretty interesting.
Okay, I'm going to be conscious of time. This is super interesting.
Yes.
We should have you back because it seems like it's
No, thank
topic,
you so much
but
for the invitation, and it's
yeah.
been great to share our work. And if people want to follow with me, they can email me, and I can try to address their questions.
Great. If you want to share that, you can post in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and plug our upcoming webinars. But for those of you who, we had a technical glitch at the beginning there. So we had more than 100 people register, which is usually fine, and we're set up for that. But we had a Zoom setting glitch. So if anyone you know got blocked out and couldn't register and missed the webinar, we'll post it at least in part, if not in full, on the YouTube channel at Vertec HQ. You can find a whole host of the webinars there. So just so you know, I'm sorry if the start was a little rocky. Thank you so much, Dr. Arellano. Thank you, Fernando, again. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you what's coming up. And so on October 13th is our next webinar from 3 to 4 p.m. on a Wednesday. We kick off a 3-part series with Dr. Joe Clark, who's a professor of neurology at University of Cincinnati. And the series will be on neural visual training for sports performance enhancement. The series will start with a webinar on peripheral vision. That's the one on October 13th, specifically how do we train peripheral vision. Then the one following that is on October 27th, which is another Wednesday from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern time. And the subject of that one will be the advantages of a multidisciplinary approach. So this webinar will feature Shelley Massingale, who is one of our main facilitators of our customer training course for clinicians that use our computerized dynamic posturography, Vertec CDP. She's the administrative director for sports medicine across the Banner Health system, and she'll be sharing the structure of that program and the best practices she's discovered and some key learnings for running a multidisciplinary practice there. So if any of you are interested in that, tune in on the 27th. And I just want to thank you all again for the really lively chat. It's always so fun when people have such great questions and get excited about this research. So thanks again to Dr. Arellano, Dr. Santos, and we'll see you all again next time.